The AK-47 is probably the most recognized object in the modern world. It is more than just a rifle. It is a global icon. It appears on national flags, on coins, and in the hands of revolutionaries and statues of dictators alike. It is a tool of liberation, and it is an instrument of absolute terror. But the story of how it was actually created and what it did to the soul of the man who designed it is something few people truly understand. We often think of it as just a piece of stamped steel and wood, but its history is a strange web of peasant ingenuity, stolen German science, and Cold War paranoia. We are going to tell you this whole dark story. We will explore the engineering brilliance that makes it unkillable, the geopolitical nightmares it unleashed, and the blowback that haunts superpowers to this day. And we'll save the absolute worst for the end, the final private confession of Mikhail Kalashnikov. To understand the weapon, you must first understand the man. And to understand the man, you have to look at the suffering that forged him. Mikhail Timofeyevich Kalashnikov was born into a life that promised nothing but hardship. He was the 17th of 19 children born to peasant parents in the Altai Krai region of Russia. The harsh reality of the early Soviet era meant that of those 19 children, only 8 would survive to adulthood. His young life was defined by struggle. His family was branded as kulaks, wealthy peasants, and deported to Siberia when he was a boy. He grew up in the bitter cold, hunting for food to survive. Yet, amidst the hunger and the political terror, he dreamed of creation. He didn't dream of guns. He dreamed of agricultural machinery. He wanted to design better plows, better tractors, tools to help his people farm the frozen land. He wrote poetry. He was a tinkerer, a dreamer. But history had other plans. In 1941, the German war machine smashed into the Soviet Union. The aspiring engineer was drafted into the Red Army, not as a weapons designer, but as a tank commander. In October of that year, during the ferocious Battle of Bryansk, his T-34 tank was struck by a German shell. Shrapnel tore into his shoulder. That explosion ended his war as a soldier, but it started something far more significant. He spent 6 long months recovering in a hospital bed. It was there, in the smell of antiseptic and old blood, that the AK-47 was truly born. He wasn't drawing blueprints yet. He was listening. He lay there, listening to fellow Soviet soldiers bitterly complaining about their rifles. They spoke of the Mosin Nagant, a bolt-action relic from the previous century. They spoke of how their weapons jammed in the mud, how they were outgunned by the Germans who had automatic submachine guns. Kalashnikov took this personally. He felt the weight of every dead Soviet soldier who had died trying to cycle a bolt-action rifle while the enemy sprayed them with fire. He discharged from the hospital with a singular obsession, to build a weapon that would protect his motherland. But he didn't invent this in a vacuum. To understand what Kalashnikov was trying to create, you have to look at what the enemy had already figured out. By the middle of the war, the Germans had deployed the Sturmgewehr 44, or STG-44. This was the world's first true assault rifle, and it represented a massive leap in ballistics theory. Before this, militaries relied on heavy battle rifles, firing massive, full-power cartridges designed to kill a man at over a kilometer away. But combat data from the war revealed a startling truth. Most firefights actually took place under 300 meters. Within this radius, those massive rounds were simply overkill. They created too much recoil, making the guns impossible to control in automatic fire, and the ammunition was so heavy that a soldier could only carry a limited amount. Submachine guns went in the opposite direction, firing pistol rounds. They were controllable, but they were useless beyond 50 or 100 meters. The Germans found the sweet spot. They developed the intermediate cartridge. If every soldier carried a rifle that bridged the gap, effective at 300 meters, capable of automatic fire, and using lighter ammo, a single infantryman could carry hundreds of rounds without breaking his back. The Soviets saw the STG-44 on the battlefield, and they knew they were behind. And this brings us to one of the more controversial parts of the AK's history. In 1946, under Operation Osoaviakhim, Soviet forces conducted a massive, coordinated raid. In the middle of the night, they rounded up over 2,000 German scientists and engineers, including Hugo Schmeisser, the lead designer of the STG-44. They were politely but firmly told to pack their bags. They were moving to the Soviet Union to assist in weapons development. While Kalashnikov always claimed his design was purely original, the presence of the world's leading small arms designer working in the same facility is hard to ignore. However, the AK-47 was not a clone. Internally, it was different. Kalashnikov used a rotating bolt system closer to the American M1 Garand. His genius wasn't necessarily invention, it was synthesis. He combined the best features of every major weapon into one package. But the real magic of the AK-47, the thing that makes it legendary, is its reliability. And that reliability comes from a very specific engineering philosophy: loose tolerances. Western engineering, especially at the time, was obsessed with precision. Rifles were built like Swiss watches with tight-fitting parts that slid together perfectly. The problem is, war is not a clean room. War is mud, sand, grit, and carbon buildup. When a piece of sand gets into a tight machine, the machine stops. Kalashnikov went the opposite direction. He designed the AK with generous gaps between the moving parts. If you shake an AK-47, it rattles. That rattle is the sound of survival. It means that when mud or debris gets into the receiver, there is space for it to move around without jamming the mechanism. Then there is the gas system. The AK uses a long-stroke gas piston. When you fire a round, gas is tapped from the barrel and pushes a massive steel piston that is physically attached to the bolt carrier. This is a heavy, violent moving mass. When it moves back, it does so with incredible momentum. It has enough kinetic energy to crush through grime, ice, or sand that would stop other guns cold. It is not the most accurate system. That heavy piston shifting back and forth throws off your aim. But for a conscript army, often with little training, fighting in the mud of Eastern Europe, pinpoint accuracy didn't matter. What mattered was that when you pulled the trigger, the gun went bang, every single time. By the 1950s, the design was perfected with the AKM, which used a stamped metal receiver to make the weapon lighter and, crucially, cheaper to mass produce. And this is where the story shifts from engineering to geopolitics. This is where things start getting dark. The Soviet Union decided to use the AK-47 not just as a weapon of war, but as a tool of ideological influence. They didn't just sell the guns, they gave the technology away. This was fraternal aid. If you were a developing nation, a socialist republic, or a rebel group claiming to fight against capitalism, the Soviets would send you the blueprints and set up a factory for you. Bulgaria, China, East Germany, Egypt, Iraq, North Korea, Poland, Romania, Yugoslavia. They all began churning out their own variants. This decision resulted in an estimated 100 million units being produced. No other rifle in history comes close. It flooded the world with cheap, reliable firepower, ensuring that long after the Soviet Union collapsed, their rifles would still be killing people. The first major test of this philosophy against the West came in the jungles of Vietnam. For American troops, Vietnam was a nightmare of terrain and heat, but it was also a crisis of weaponry. The United States had just introduced the M16. On paper, it was a space-age weapon, light, accurate, high-tech. In the jungle, it was a disaster. The early M16s suffered from a failure to chrome plate the chamber and issues with the ammunition powder. American troops, Marines, and soldiers fighting for their lives reported their rifles jamming in the middle of firefights. They would be found dead with their rifles disassembled next to them, having tried desperately to clean them in the heat of the battle. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong and the NVA were armed with AK-47s supplied by China and Russia. Their guns worked when wet. They worked when dragged through the mud. it became a national scandal in the US. It got so bad that some American special forces and infantry units began to use captured AKs or purchasing Chinese variants on the black market just to survive. By the end of Vietnam, the AK had cemented its reputation. It was the people's rifle, the unshakable weapon of the underdog.
But if Vietnam made the AK famous, Afghanistan exposed the true irony of the weapon. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. To counter them, the United States CIA launched Operation Cyclone. The goal was to arm the Afghan Mujahideen fighters. But the U.S. couldn't send American weapons. That would be an act of war. They needed plausible deniability. So the CIA went shopping. They bought hundreds of thousands of AK-47s from China and Egypt, using American tax dollars, and funneled them into the mountains of Afghanistan. It worked. The Soviets were bled dry and eventually withdrew. But when the war ended, the weapons didn't disappear. Afghanistan became the most heavily armed society on Earth. And tragically, those same rifles, bought by the CIA to fight communism, were turned against American troops when they invaded in 2001. The cycle of violence was fueled by the very weapon designed to end it. This is the phenomenon of blowback in its purest, most metallic form. The chaos didn't stop there. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, the floodgates opened. The security of the state dissolved, and massive military stockpiles were left unguarded or were sold off by corrupt officers for pennies on the dollar. The global black market was suddenly saturated. In parts of West Africa during the 1990s and early 2000s, the price of an AK-47 plummeted. As one UN report famously noted, in some regions you could buy an AK-47 for the price of a chicken. This accessibility changed the nature of warfare itself. Because the weapon is so simple, durable, and light, it allowed for the rise of a horrific new demographic in war, the child soldier. You do not need to be strong to operate an AK. You do not need years of training. A commander can teach a 10-year-old boy to strip, clean, and fire an AK-47 in less than an hour. It democratized violence in the absolute worst way possible. Mechanically, the design continued to evolve, and not always for the better of humanity. In 1974, the Soviets introduced the AK-74. This was a response to the American switch to smaller, faster bullets. The AK-74 fired the 5.45 by 39 mm cartridge. When this new rifle hit the battlefield in Afghanistan, the Mujahideen noticed something terrifying about the wounds it inflicted. They called it the poison bullet. They believed the tips were laced with arsenic or chemical agents. They weren't. The horror was purely physics. The Russian engineers had designed the bullet with a small hollow airspace in the tip. This shifted the center of gravity to the rear. When this bullet strikes soft tissue, it doesn't pass through cleanly. It immediately destabilizes. It tumbles, yaws, and turns sideways as it travels through the body. The result is a massive, erratic wound channel that is far more devastating than the older, heavier rounds. It wasn't poison. It was just brutal, calculated engineering designed to incapacitate the enemy as efficiently as possible. Today, the legacy of the AK is everywhere. But there is one final strange statistic that shows just how deeply ingrained this weapon is in criminal culture. In South Africa, the situation is so bizarre that criminals often don't even buy weapons anymore. A 2024 investigation revealed the existence of rental syndicates. Gangs will lease an AK-47 for a day or a week to pull off a highway heist and then return it, just like a rental car. The weapon has become a service, a utility of crime. So we return to the man, Mikhail Kalashnikov. For most of his life, he was a hero of the Soviet Union. He lived comfortably, adorned with medals. He always maintained a stoic defense of his creation. He would say, "I designed this rifle to defend the borders of my motherland. It is not my fault that politicians and terrorists use it for evil." He slept soundly for decades. But time has a way of eroding certainty. As he entered his 90s, the sheer weight of the numbers began to crush him. An estimated 250,000 people are killed by his invention every single year. In 2012, at the age of 91, just a year before his death, he wrote a private letter to the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. This letter was not the words of a proud Soviet hero. It was the confession of a tortured soul. He wrote, "My spiritual pain is unbearable. I keep having the same unsolved question. If my rifle took away people's lives, then can it be that I, Mikhail Kalashnikov, am guilty for people's deaths, even if they were enemies?" He asked why the Almighty allowed humans to have such devilish desires of envy and aggression. He was a man who had spent his life building a shield for his people, only to realize he had flooded the world with swords. We will never know if he found peace. He died in 2013. And at his funeral, as his coffin was lowered into the ground, a final salute was fired, a crackling volley from the very AK-47 rifles that will carry his name forever.